by our study group leader and Institute of Politics fellow Jess White, who has served as the Executive Director of the Southern Growth Policies Board, an organization that serves the research needs of the Southern governors, of which our guest was one. Over the last several weeks, Jess White has led a study group entitled Politics Southern Style, and you're going to hear some of that this evening from Jess White and from our guest. Let me thank, though, while I have the opportunity, those who've worked so hard to make these study groups at the Institute of Politics a success, from Catherine Den, our student activities coordinator, to David Sokolow, our erstwhile study group's chair, from the Student Advisory Committee, to all of the students who have worked very hard to make these successful study group classes on Tuesdays and Wednesdays here at the IOP. With that, please welcome Jess White, an Institute of Politics fellow, who will introduce our guest speaker this evening.
Thank you, Charlie. It's good to be back at the forum tonight, especially with someone who speaks the same language, Chuck Robb of Virginia. Whenever I address a group up here at Harvard or in the Boston area, and of course I went to graduate school here, I'm reminded of the story of a man who was in the Senate sometime before Senator Robb, and that is Jim Eastland of Mississippi. As a matter of fact, some of you have heard me say that I was a grown man before I realized that the United States Senate was an elected office. In Mississippi, John Stennis and Jim Eastland were there from the early 40s until recently. But this is apparently a true story about Eastland, and he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and the subcommittee was meeting in the room. So Eastland needed something, and so he came in through the side entrance, which was very unusual, and the little staff assistant there sort of jumped to attention. It was very unusual for the chairman to come in the side door, and he said, Mr. Chairman, is there something I can do for you? And Eastland looked around and said, feel hot in here. And they said, well, yes, sir, Senator, we'll get the air conditioner cranked up. He scowled, and a few minutes later he said, feel hot in here. And he said, well, Senator, we're getting the air, and we're getting this cool just as quick as possible. And Eastland looked at him and said, no, boy, you didn't understand me. I asked you, is Senator Phil hot in here? So I'm glad to be here with someone who will have no trouble understanding me, and I hope you'll have no trouble understanding either one of us. I, too, would like to join Charlie, and I know I speak on behalf of myself and the other 5 fellows to say a word of gratitude to really the extraordinary group of undergraduates here, the Student Advisory Council to the IOP. I know in conversation all 6 of us have said time and again how amazed and impressed we've been at the truly committed hands-on work of the Student Advisory Committee, the undergraduates. It really is true that much of what the Institute and Jeff Livingston, Bruce Goldberger and Kim Morgan, the SAC co-chairs, and David Sokolow, who, as Charlie said, heads the study group section. I would also like to thank my study group entitled Electoral Politics Southern Style, who's seated up front here. This is the concluding group of our meeting of our study group, for helping make this semester so stimulating and enjoyable for me. They really have made it a lively and wonderful re-entry for me back onto the electoral side of politics, having worked on the policy side really for the last 10 years. It's been a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed being with you very much. I think, like a lot of you, your age, maybe not all of you, but as some of you, my first memory, of course, of Chuck Robb was when he married the president's daughter, Linda Bird Johnson, as a dashing, handsome Marine. Those senators who still consider you rather dashing and handsome, I'm sure you'll be relieved to know. My first personal meeting with the senator was when he was running for the governor of Virginia in 1981. He called me up, I think, based on a call with a chat with our mutual friend, Governor William Winter of Mississippi, to explore the possibility of me working in his campaign. And I met with him at his home and even went to Richmond and spent a day where he was in the throes of presiding over the Senate, met with his staff, met with his main political people, and came away convinced he was going to win. He had everybody in the state already lined up on his side. And although I was at a position in my career where I really couldn't work it out to be in the campaign, I remember how incredibly impressed I was with his political skills at the time, and he and I have been friends ever since. He was elected governor and served from 1982 to 1986. And during that time, he was an active member of my board of directors, which was the Southern Growth Policies Board, involved in our programs. He also served as chairman of the Southern Governors Association and the Education Commission on the states. But it's my view that Governor Robb accomplished one of his most impressive political feats, really one of the most impressive political feats in recent American political history, in his last year in office, a time at which, under conventional theory, a governor's power should have waned to practically nothing. He led the machinery of his party, the Democratic Party in Virginia, to put together a ticket, a slate, of Gerald Baliles for governor, of Doug Wilder for lieutenant governor, and Sue Turney for attorney general. They won that election, and of course, the rest is history. Gerald Baliles made an outstanding governor, and Doug Wilder now sits in the capital of the Confederacy as America's first popularly elected black governor. It was Robb's engineering, in my opinion, of this miracle, which led me in part to proclaim in my opening address to the forum here in early February that popular primaries may be a failed experiment in American democracy. Because Virginia is the only Democratic Party in the South which still uses a convention system to nominate. I believe that's still correct. And I'm convinced that this slate building, which Governor Robb put together, is very difficult, if not impossible, to occur in popular long ballot primaries, which we have in the rest of the South. I know in my experience in Mississippi, it was always frustrating because we were constantly seeking the black support, for example, for white candidates, and yet it was very difficult to say, okay, we will return the favor and, for example, have a black candidate run as Secretary of State, and we will support him or her in return for support for the white candidate for governor or whatever. Very difficult to build tickets like he did in Virginia. I think he has some disagreement with me on that, but we'll hear him out on it when he speaks. I'm beginning to come back to the position that some retreat from the popular primaries might be in order. But anyway, be that as it may, after Governor Robb left office, he entered law practice, but he continued to be active in public life. We impressed him back into duty in 1986 as a member of the Commission on the Future of the South, where he served with distinction with a fellow Virginian, former Senator Bill Spong, and helped produce the final report of that commission called Halfway Home and a Long Way to Go, which has been considered one of the most influential public policy documents in Southern history. It was also during this time that he helped form the Democratic Leadership Council. In 1988, Chuck Robb was elected to the Senate from Virginia. He is often mentioned as presidential timber in the Democratic Party. And I know from personal observations at meetings I attended through 1986 and 1987, meetings of the Southern Legislative Conference, that Southern legislators had someone like Chuck Robb in mind. In fact, many of them had Chuck Robb himself in mind when they moved to create Super Tuesday. And a number have said that the failure of someone like Chuck Robb to have emerged early in that process may have led to the failure of Super Tuesday.
Thank you, Jess. I am delighted to be able to join you this evening and to provide the endpoint for your group study session and to return actually to this particular spot. I don't know if there's anybody who is present this evening that happened to be present. There's no reason you would remember that I was one of the participants the last time that I happened to be here personally, but it happened to be in my capacity then as chairman of the Democratic Leadership Council, to which Jess made reference. We were co-sponsoring with the Kennedy School at that time, as a matter of fact, a forum that we entitled, as I recall, The Distorting Lens, how the news media covers the race for the presidency, or something to that effect. And we had the interesting, some might say fortuitous timing of having scheduled this event quite a number of months in advance, and having even lost 2 or 3 of the national news media participants who were going to be on it because they had that very day been diverted by their own news organization to cover a story that had just broken in the Miami Herald about a particular then candidate for the presidency who had been a senator from the state of Colorado. As you can imagine, that was a very interesting night here because we had maybe more media who were interested again in what their role in all this might be and how it was being perceived, as there were individuals who were a part of the Institute of Government and Politics, the Kennedy School, others who were associated with the university or the community. But it was a heightened evening that I shall long remember. In any event, tonight I would like to talk a little bit from a Democratic perspective about party apparatus, if you will, more importantly, what I think that the Democratic Party ought to be doing if we're indeed to return to some position that might give us an opportunity to compete on at least a level playing field with a real chance of winning in the presidential sweepstakes at some point down the line. I do so knowing that you're not necessarily all on the Democratic side, and I offer this as a perspective of one who is trying to at least return at the presidential level to 2-party competitive politics, where at one time we had a very distinct advantage, and where in the most recent years, obviously, we have not done all that well, particularly if you look at the track record in losing 5 out of the last 6 elections. So let me begin, if I may, with a little bit of history. As many of you may recall, the Democratic Party began early in the 19th century as then the party of limited government, because many good people believed that the centralizing policies of their political opponents would encroach on the liberties of working people and somehow make government the tool of the social and economic elites. Early in this century, however, the progressives turned to government. They turned to government to regulate the economic concentration and some of the wrenching dislocations that had been caused by our country's rapid industrialization. At this point, they wanted a national government that was strong enough to check the enormous power of monopolies, and as Woodrow Wilson put it, restore opportunity for ordinary people. In the 1930s, you will recall that Franklin Roosevelt used government to rally a dispirited nation and in many instances save capitalism from itself. In the 1940s, Harry Truman used government to rebuild Western Europe, thereby sowing the seed of the great flower of democracy we are today witnessing in Eastern Europe. In the 1960s, this school's namesake, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, used federal power to guarantee civil rights and promote social equity. And in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter used government in the international arena to advance the cause of human rights. But then in 1980, under pressure from both the left and the right, the political center of the Democratic Party collapsed. Today, after 10 years of drift, defeat, and a lot of soul-searching at the national level, increasing numbers of the party have come to realize that the greatest challenge is to define themselves, to declare to the American people what Democrats stand for now in the 1990s. For too long, Democrats have let others get away with defining them in terms of programs and utopias, while the Republicans reserved for themselves the rhetoric of values and common sense. To reemerge as a presidential party, in my opinion, the Democrats are going to have to be able to remind the American people what sets them apart and how they differ from Republicans. Democrats, it seems to me, need to articulate a set of principles and beliefs genuinely held that combine to weave a coherent vision for America. Now, some would urge us to emphasize our principles in order to appeal to the highest aspirations in voters. Others would urge us to emphasize our principles because, as we have seen in the last 3 presidential elections, values will beat programs every time. But regardless of motivation, the Democratic Party is going to have to reaffirm our principles and our beliefs because we simply allowed opponents to soil them unjustly. Because there's no shame in standing for the individual. Because widespread ignorance of these principles made the 1980s a decade characterized too often by greed and materialism and sometimes egomania, and too infrequently by respect and civility and compassion. For too many, a lost decade with respect to the values which define America's true greatness. These are the values that have traditionally guided the Democratic Party. Strength tempered with wisdom, compassion coupled with responsibility, equality, inclusion, and respect for the sovereignty of the individual. These are some of the values that I believe can unite this party once again. These, when you stop and think about it, are simply the values of America. Our nation faces some rather grave difficulties as the 1990s begin, and tonight, if you'll permit me, I'd like to explore the philosophical framework that I believe that we ought to consider as we confront, among other things, the precipitous decline of America's economic power and our prestige in world markets, the failure of our education system to prepare our children for the demands of a global economy, the growing gap between rich and poor, and the persistence of an underclass of jobless men and single mothers. The constant threat of violent crime and the quickening pace of environmental destruction, which together degrade the quality of our lives. And perhaps the most basic problem from which the others flow, the erosion of our sense of mutual obligation and common purpose. In the last decade, we've heard a torrent of warm words from the White House. We've had the Madison Avenue vision of America wave before our eyes as if it were already a universal reality. And yet the programs that are needed to achieve this reality have arrived not at a torrent, but at best in a trickle. In my view, the Republicans have simply run out of ideas for dealing with many of America's emerging problems. Leadership, I believe, is more than muddling through and just hoping that our luck holds. Leadership is more than sitting on your lead. A lead, let me point out, for which Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Jimmy Carter deserve a large share of the credit. Leadership is ideas and vision, fortitude to be thought wrong by some for sticking to principles that most people know are right. Leadership means speaking plainly and then making good on your word. I don't happen to accept the view that stallball and complacency constitute leadership. I don't even think they're shrewd politics. America has had all of that kind of shrewd politics it can stand. Democrats, I would submit, ought to be fed up with Republicans sitting on America's lead. But we can't just sit in the shade. Democrats have to be out there working, hustling, and offering the American people something better, a progressive alternative to our nation's current course of complacency and inertia. It seems to me that we should be advancing a specific creative agenda for rebuilding the foundations of our economic and personal security while creating new opportunities for all our people to realize their potential. Tonight, I'd like to focus on a question that is central to a proper understanding of the Democrats' mission, and that's rethinking the role of government. For over half a century, the Democratic Party's identity has been closely linked to the vigorous and expansive use of federal power. But I think it's time to take another look at that particular relationship. A lot of the federal programs that were progressive and vital when they were put in place were designed long ago to deal with problems that either no longer exist or at least aren't as high on our priority list as they once were. I'd like to see Democrats begin to regain their proper role as partners of the common man by leading the nation in a systematic reevaluation of the relevance of federal policies and programs. Revamping America's military defenses in the wake of communism's collapse is only the most obvious example. I believe that we need to take a hard look at the entire federal government, to retire programs that have achieved their original ends, and to subject the rest to more rigorous standards of performance. We have to be able to recognize when we've won and carry the battle forward in those areas where our efforts can still make a difference. In my view, such an exercise is both a political and substantive imperative for the Democratic Party. The party simply can't allow an attachment to existing federal programs to bind it to the political status quo. Why? Well, because the current climate of fiscal insolvency and legislative gridlock, which most of you are aware of, exists too often in Washington, simply isn't conducive to the kind of bold and imaginative thinking we need today. And again, because programs don't vote, people do. The Democratic Party doesn't exist to serve programs. It exists to serve people. Fiscal insolvency and legislative gridlock do suit the political strategy of the Republicans, however, because they have been able to use large deficits to stifle public initiative and keep Democrats on the defensive over taxes. In truth, the Republicans have actually discovered the joy of profligacy. But those who benefit most are those least in need because they have confined their giveaways to the tax side of the ledger. Meanwhile, the misuse of Social Security tax revenue keeps the deficit looking small, small enough to be manageable, and yet large enough to keep Congress preoccupied with the Graham-Rudman charade. In this atmosphere of contrived austerity, everyone scrambles to protect existing programs, which have vocal constituencies, and to discredit new approaches, which don't. The result is to marginalize the political debate, ignore the central issues, feed a growing perception of governmental paralysis, and in the final analysis, to focus government on squabbles, not public service. Well, how can Democrats break out of this austerity trap? To seize the political initiative and to achieve progressive goals for the 1990s, I believe Democrats first have to demonstrate the toughness to govern. It's not the Hollywood toughness of Rambo. It's moral toughness based on solid principles, personal integrity, and a healthy skepticism toward business as usual in Washington. Instead of fighting rearguard actions to preserve programs created in the 30s and 60s, Democrats need to realize that the world has changed. We need now to recapture the bold vision and the experimental spirit that are the true legacy of Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Johnson. I think those visionary and pragmatic men would be astonished to learn that their initiatives, which sometimes started little more than improvised responses to an immediate crisis, have achieved the political equivalent of immortality. And I think they'd be more than a little dismayed. For example, I believe it's instructive to consider the case of federal deposit insurance, which you may recall Roosevelt put in place during the Depression to restore public confidence in the nation's banking system. From that sensible expedient has grown the vast array of federal insurance for all kinds of activities: culminating in today's crisis of massive unfunded public liabilities for pensions and savings and loans. Obviously, Washington can't afford to indemnify all citizens against every conceivable risk. Moreover, our banking system is far more stable today than it was 60 years ago. Now, I realize that some of the questions I'm asking make many of my friends in both banking and thrift institutions a little uneasy. But so far, I haven't received a very satisfactory answer as to why American taxpayers should take all the risk for private depositors. I keep thinking that we ought to, and keep suggesting that we ought to think seriously about dropping the level of protection for an individual account, eliminating the protection altogether of multiple deposits for a single depositor, and then phase in a degree of coinsurance even for the individual depositor or saver. That way we would refocus our efforts on the small individual accounts of those least likely to have the ability, the resources, or the sophistication to assess the financial health of the various specific institutions. And we'd also be able to refocus attention on those most legitimately in need of government, which you might read taxpayer protection. With the new speculation that you heard about Thursday and Friday of last week as to how much the thrift bailout is ultimately going to cost the taxpayers, I don't think we have any choice. The point is not to abolish federal insurance altogether, but to rethink its purpose and scope in light of changed conditions. American business has begun to recognize that it's competing in a global marketplace, and that the rules are different now. They've begun to adapt to those changing rules. Government, as far as I'm concerned, needs to be at least as responsive, because it too is facing conditions that it simply hasn't faced before. So far, the Republicans haven't risen to the occasion. And I believe the time has come for a new generation of Democrats. Democrats schooled in the goal of public service to invent new and, in many cases, radically different approaches for tackling some of the challenges that are facing our country. The first step, as far as I'm concerned, has got to be breaking the fiscal impasse that stifles our economy, entangles Congress, and deadens our political imagination. Because Republicans in this area simply won't lead, Democrats have an opportunity and, in my judgment, should respond and demonstrate the resolve and integrity to weigh competing claims on our resources, then set clear priorities and stick with them. In that way, Democrats will be able to earn the credibility that is going to be needed to make the public investments that America needs. To rebuild our economy and to meet the needs of the citizens who most need Americans' help, we've got to redeploy the resources that we have. That's not just a paper exercise, as some suggest. It requires a fundamental redirection of national priorities away from consumption and toward investment in our people and in our nation's stock of public capital. The choices we face are not very pleasant, but they're not terribly complicated either. We're going to have to take a hard look at federal entitlements and mandatory spending programs. These programs are popular with some very powerful interest. They're also nearly half of our $1.2 trillion budget. We cannot, as far as I'm concerned, in good conscience or good faith, declare that half of our budget is out of bounds on day one. Every program has an economic cost and a political cost. For example, should we spend less on farm price supports in order to help achieve our progressive goal of extending health insurance to all Americans? There are good reasons for each. There are also powerful political and financial interests behind each. But these are the kinds of choices we need to weigh, and we need to do so with only one goal in mind, and that's the public good. Another example, and this one will hit a little closer to home, should federal student aid programs, from which some of you, and I suspect many of your classmates, benefit, be replaced by national service programs, which ask recipients of public largesse to give something back to their country and to their communities. I happen to be pushing for such a change because every dollar that is spent on national service is actually a double investment in our people, in those who serve and in those whom they serve. Besides, federal student aid subsidies really aren't working as well as they were intended to work, and they leave too many people out. I'd like to see us replace the politics of entitlement with a new politics of reciprocal responsibility. I haven't proposed and won't support massive reductions, certainly this year, in defense spending that aren't based on a revised threat assessment and credible new force structure. But I believe that we can go well beyond what the President has proposed in scaling our military forces down to the true dimensions of the threats that we face today, and we need to channel some of those savings into helping emerging democracies abroad. And of course, helping the new democracies will help develop new markets for our own goods and services. It will also serve to enhance our influence in the world. But to me, the bottom line is that every dollar spent on transforming yesterday's enemies into today's friends is a dollar that we won't have to spend on weapons. Still, cutting spending alone won't free up enough resources. We're going to need more for the crucial national investments that I'm talking about. So we're also going to need to raise revenues, and we need to do it with as progressive a system as possible. Our current tactic of relying on increases in the regressive payroll tax clearly isn't fair or honorable. To that extent, at least, I agree with Senator Moynihan of New York, and I hope that we can find a way to substitute a more progressive approach soon for the one that's currently in effect in that area. Finally, as we reorder our national spending priorities, it seems to me that we need to think anew about which level of government is best suited to tackle our most urgent needs, and whether, in fact, government really ought to be involved in some activities at all. Responsibilities that were once entrusted to Washington may today be better managed by the states or by local government if a legitimate role for government in those areas still remains. There is no reason at all, I would submit, for us to consider the current division of responsibilities among the various levels of government as being immutable. In fact, it strikes me as being rather odd that at the very time the rest of the world is moving away from highly centralized government and top-down bureaucracies, the United States somehow seems stuck with the old model. Perhaps it's time for a little perestroika here as well. What I believe we need is flexible federalism that embraces new ways to deliver public goods and services. Not just in Eastern Europe, but in democracies from Mexico to Australia to the heartland of social democracy in Sweden. People are adapting their institutions of government to a post-industrial economy based on the rapid movement of information and capital. They are discovering what we have failed to grasp, that decentralizing decision-making and providing services at the lowest possible level of government rather than the highest makes for greater flexibility and fewer bureaucratic obstacles to adapting to new circumstances. In any case, the rise of the global marketplace necessarily means a reduction in Washington's ability to control economic outcomes here at home. It's simply a question of economies of scale. The federal government is too small to manage the global economy, and it's too large to address the varying needs of America's incredibly diverse communities. So the bottom line is this: the old model of large central bureaucracies producing standardized services for distant clients is simply becoming obsolete. As a result, some federal programs seem increasingly ineffective, if not actually unworkable. In some parts of our federal government, if some parts of our federal government were in Eastern Europe, chances are they'd be out in the street by now. For example, our social welfare policies are good at transferring income, but not particularly good at actually lifting people out of poverty and dependence. Too often, federal housing programs for the poor have only produced poor housing. And despite steadily rising federal spending on education, including the creation of a national department, our schools are doing a substandard job of educating our young people for work and for citizenship. The typical liberal response is to say that we can make these programs work if only we're willing to spend more. But even if that were true, and frankly I doubt that it is, we won't have the money to spend more unless we undertake a thorough review of our tax and spending priorities. And even then we might not. Spending is not, in and of itself, a good answer. It never has been entirely the right answer. There is an alternative to spending more, and it's thinking more and spending more wisely. It is re-examining traditional policies and programs critically with a truly open mind. It is exploring creative ways to educate all Americans, house all Americans, and develop personal capacities for all Americans. Toward these ends, I believe the Democratic Party should lead the nation toward a new progressive compact between Washington and the states. Such a compact would have several goals. First and foremost would be to improve the delivery of public goods and services. We should experiment with ways to shift the decision-making power from central bureaucracies to individual communities. We also need to judge programs on the basis of performance rather than spending, on output rather than input. New approaches should also offer people wider choices and should foster competition, which drives innovation in the public as well as private domain. I believe that we also need to apply our ingenuity to using public resources in ways that shape and guide the marketplace toward that desired end. For all their size, federal programs are often far too limited in their impact to really solve the problems that we face. And we shouldn't be reluctant to look beyond government programs to private and civic endeavors to address our needs. The second goal would be to simplify administration by separating national and local functions. As former Congressional Budget Office Director Alice Rivlin has argued, Washington ought to focus on tasks that are intrinsically national, such as defense, or that can be done most effectively at the national level, such as social insurance. The federal government ought also to manage those functions that really require uniformity. It should engage in strategic planning, set national goals and standards, and, through the federal courts, protect basic citizenship rights. Beyond these functions, however, I believe we ought to give back to the states primary responsibility for building public infrastructure and delivering community services. Choices in education, transportation, housing, job training, child care, drug treatment, law enforcement, and economic development are best addressed and made by state and local governments. The third goal of a new progressive compact would be to make sure that the states can afford to make these investments. That's where the current approach to federalism falls short, as demonstrated by the administration's recent proposals to shift transportation responsibilities to the states without giving them a corresponding mechanism to fund those programs. Rather than placing the entire burden on the states to impose new taxes, I think that we ought to consider creating a common tax that would be raised nationally but would be shared with the states on the basis of population. Yes, I'm talking about reinstituting some form of federal revenue sharing. When we do look at the revenue picture, though, any new taxes we pass to fund crucial public investments ought to fall on consumption and not on labor or our already low savings. A common tax on energy, adjusted to offset the regressive impact of any flat tax, would have the added benefit of reducing America's growing reliance on foreign sources of energy. That's a fringe benefit for all of us. The fourth and last goal would be to free Washington from the paralysis of deficit politics. Alice Rivlin estimates that Washington can turn over to the states between $35 and $50 billion worth of community infrastructure development programs. Now, I know this won't be terribly popular with some of my colleagues. One of my Senate predecessors, in fact, John Randolph, was not the first to recognize what he called, quote, that most delicious of privileges, spending other people's money. Nor, if you take a look around the Capitol today, from some of the individual fiefdoms, was he the last. But by removing these programs from Washington's domain and giving them back to the states and localities, we'd move closer to solvency in Washington and permit Congress to shift its attention from pork barreling and micromanagement to those truly national problems which may well require an expanded federal role. Let me give you an example of the latter. Several years ago, as governor of Virginia, I had the privilege of co-chairing a committee on federalism and the national purpose, which recommended a swap in which the states would take on community service programs while Washington would assume greater responsibility for welfare and health care for the poor. I liked that concept then, and even today, as a member of the Senate, that still strikes me as a fair trade. In any case, I believe that a progressive compact designed along those lines could usher in a new era of public innovation and entrepreneurship. I would submit that the Democratic Party is the logical candidate to lead this process of rethinking and innovation in the public sphere, because historically Democrats have been willing to embrace public activism to promote opportunity and social progress. That's in the greatest tradition of the Democratic Party. But a caution is in order. The Democratic Party will not become America's governing party by identifying itself as the party of government. The point is simply this. At the national level, Democrats ought to focus, in my judgment, on the large national purposes and not define their mission as governmental activism for its own sake. Our fundamental and enduring purpose ought to be to expand opportunity, not government. And our success will be measured not in dollars spent, but in lives improved. For most of our lives, America has been the preeminent presence in the world. In every sphere of endeavor, industry, commerce, education, the arts, America has been first. In Eastern Europe and Central America, we've observed just how much other peoples are willing to go through just to get some of what we already have. They find the American example worth battering down walls for. I want America, and I want the Democratic Party to take a few chances. Stop playing it safe. We've got to challenge some assumptions and shake up the status quo. We can't be afraid to topple some totems or stampede some sacred cows. After all, where there are sacred cows, there's bound to be a lot of bull. Too often, America has been asked, we have been asked for the past 10 years to accept indifference, inaction, and ultimately insolvency. I'd like to see the Democratic Party answer with energy, innovation, and ultimately success. If the Democrats will do this, stop reminiscing about the glory days and start living up to them, then it seems to me the Democratic Party will be in a position once again to lead America, to serve America, and to be worthy of the man whose name this school bears. And I thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator. I think you all see why he is considered one of the thinkers about trying to get the party in a position where it can achieve a majority again in presidential races with that thought-provoking address. I have promised my class that I would give them first shot at questions of the senator. I I will take the liberty of leading off with one, give you a second to perhaps collect your thoughts, and then we'll open it up to the entire forum. One of the guests last week at our study group, Senator, is a noted Democratic pollster, and he operates out of Washington. I've told you his name, but that was off the record, and since this is on the record, perhaps I won't mention his name. But he said he was got a call one day in his Washington office to come over and join the leadership of Congress to think about themes for the Democratic Party. And he said he rolled his eyes and said, "Oh my God, another meeting on themes." But he said he went over and he met with some of the leadership, I think, of the House. But he said before he went to his garage and sawed off a 2x4 and put it in his briefcase. And they went around the room talking about themes of the Democratic Party. And they came to this gentleman and said, "What do you think?" And he opened his briefcase and pulled out a 2x4. Didn't say anything. They said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "This means take this 2x4, go to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, and beat the hell out of the president." And it raised, the question of sort of the free ride that, at least in my view as a Democrat, Reagan got, and it appears to me Bush is getting too. Now, you've talked about a positive vision of the party. I'd like maybe for you to make a few comments about where the party has dropped the ball in really holding the opposition accountable for what it's given the nation or failed to give it over the last 10 years.
Let me suggest to you that I'm not certain. You told me that several highly regarded pollsters have been here to the Kennedy School and to the Institute of Politics. I'm not certain which one you're referring to. I do have the sense that I know which member of Congress took the suggestion literally, but I'm not going to go beyond that. But I would have to say that I would disagree fundamentally with the premise, and that's that it ought to be, at least if the suggestion is that you need to take on the president in a personal sense, I think that's probably a mistake. And it has nothing to do with his popularity. I think that you ought to present a better alternative, a better idea, and I think that we ought to simply propose to fill in the void, not simply carping about the president or his own popularity or lack of popularity at any given time, but you can't beat something with nothing. And if we don't have a constructive alternative, I think that all we're going to do is appear very shrill if we take after the president. So I think we ought to point out, as I've tried to do here, and I had a couple of other speeches at a couple of other institutions that you may know something about in New Haven and Princeton in the last 24 hours, different topics altogether, but try to suggest, in one instance in the domestic arena and the other in the foreign policy arena, alternative things that I'd like to see Democrats proposing. I think there is a real opportunity. We had a chance to discuss at your focus group earlier this evening a little bit on this particular subject, but I think there is a real opportunity for Democrats right now to provide some leadership in areas where the president, although he is very popular, and it's a very personal popularity, but it is not based on the kind of commitment that will sustain him when the going gets a little bit rougher. And you could see a precipitous decline in the president's popularity if something important doesn't seem to be going as well at some point, in my judgment. Whereas I have suggested, both publicly and privately, even as the leader, and we are still Americans first, I would like to see him spend some of that very substantial reservoir of accumulated capital and goodwill to put some real meat on the table, to make some decisions and to suggest an agenda that would help us to address some of the questions that some of us are trying to fill in because we don't feel that the president has put forward the kind of agenda that America needs at this particular time in our history. But I would have to say that going after the president simply for the sake of going after the president is probably not going to enhance our role, and probably not. It may fire up some of our own partisans, but it probably won't substantially increase our standing with that great percentage of America that one day or another constitute a swing vote. So certainly take the president on when he's wrong, when we disagree with him, say so in a very upfront way, but don't go after, I don't think we ought to be perceived as going after him with a 2x4, because my own view is that would be counterproductive.
Senator, you're implying there that by taking a hard stand, the president would lose popularity. Yet you're saying the Democratic Party needs to take hard stands in order to provide an alternative choice to the American people. Thereby, one can assume that by taking a hard stand, the Democratic Party would also be losing popularity in the American people. How do you reconcile those two?
Let me suggest, in fact, I happened to use a percentage earlier on in the conversation with some of the folks in the focus group. What do you call it? The supper group, discussion group, whatever. And that's that I think he could very easily spend down from 80% to 55 to 60%. And I think that we could accomplish the same degree of critical mass if we're to put forward constructive alternatives. Something, again, that doesn't have the shrill quality that all too often has been identified with our party because we're not seen. There are a number of very thoughtful individuals and a lot of groups and others that are trying to engage this process and participate in the dialogue. But I think that you can either spend down or spend up to something over 50% very easily. So I don't think it's a matter. I happen to believe, and have believed for a long period of time, that the American people would respond from the president or from the Democratic Party, whoever gets there first, with a principled call for some sense of shared sacrifice so that everybody feels that they're participating. I used an example earlier talking about the amount of mail that I have received because I haven't just signed on to every request to increase spending. And I've said before I'm willing to participate in signing on to a variety of otherwise well-intentioned, in some cases admirable programs. I want to see dramatic evidence that we're getting serious about meeting our challenge in the area of fiscal responsibility. Well, I think a president, and the president is clearly best positioned to do that, and one of the reasons we want to, as a party, to try to rally around a candidate who can carry that message for us. But if a president were come and tell the American people not that the world is in a terrible state, that it's going through whatever, how you want to describe it, in some cases toward the end of the Carter administration, it was sometimes viewed as the malaise speech. Clearly, you can't just give people all bad news. You've got to be able, and that's part of a responsibility of leadership, to paint the brighter picture that we can ultimately achieve and our children and grandchildren can achieve if we're willing to make a few sacrifices and to also identify for the American people the consequences of our unwillingness to make some of these decisions. My own view is that there is critical mass. You'll never get to 100%. I can tell you that there is no way any political leader or anybody else is ever going to get probably much over about the 85% level under any circumstances. And in many cases, it's the most effective leader may be one who's cranking along at 50 to 55% approval rating at any given time. But if they're doing things that are important, asking the American people, the man for whom this school is named, ask not. That's probably the most famous quotation in American politics. Well, some sense that we're not simply responding in the affirmative to every single request that's made and unwilling to accept the consequences for paying for it or taking any of the downside that may be associated with it. That, to me, is what's most critically wrong with the whole process of government today. And to go back to the pollsters, we've got too many elected officials in the executive branch and the legislative branch who are more concerned about what the pollsters say at any given time than to lead public opinion to what may be a currently unpopular view, but that ultimately is going to do some good. I mean, I've heard it on both sides of the aisle, saying, well, the people don't really care about this. Well, if you know that's a terribly important problem, and I happen to believe the deficit falls in that category, then it seems to me that we ought to be willing to say so. We ought to be willing to talk about what the problems are, but how, if we act together and do something along these lines, whatever it is, that we can have that better tomorrow. But I regret to tell you that we haven't either on our side, and the Republicans have the best chance to do it, but they haven't done it either.
Is the news perspective that you share with us today, is that something that can trickle down to the states, or are we going to see sort of a national perspective of the Democratic Party and something different going on in the states? And particularly I think of the southern states where policies are somewhat more conservative.
Well, again, as a Democrat, I cannot subscribe to trickle-down theories, so you can understand that. what we're trying to do, many of us are simply frustrated. We're frustrated certainly by the lack of success at the national level, the presidential level, even though the Democratic Party at the state and local level, including federal offices and state and local offices, what have you, has remained the majority party, although it's in many areas, particularly in the South, it's somewhat nominal because a good clean sweep, if the critical mass shifted, there's a whole lot of folks that would shift their registration because they're likely to follow where the center of power, center of gravity happens to be at a particular moment. But the kinds of concepts that we're talking about, we're working, again, some of the things that I've been developing or elected officials from other areas, state and federal officials that will come in and discuss particular policy options and alternatives. But basically what we're trying to do is simply put some dialogue out there that somehow gives some sense of policy choices and direction, and hope that anyone who wants to bring about the result that, again, those of us who happen to be Democrats are tired of being relegated to the role of Remainerman in national politics, presidential politics, and we want to do something about it. So the ideas are in many cases starting with a number of elected officials who feel threatened and recognize that the twain may never meet if we don't take more responsibility for the fortunes of the national party.
Senator, as you mentioned, people in Eastern Europe are knocking down walls to vote, while here a large portion of the population doesn't even bother to vote. The proposals you've talked about tonight, do you think you can structure them so they appeal to those who aren't voting now, or are these designed to appeal to the existing pool of voters?
I guess an honest answer would be that most of the proposals I'm talking about tonight, I recognize if you have any tendency toward soporific reaction, or if you have any problem with insomnia, I can cure it for you. Regrettably, the matters that go to government structure don't generate a great deal of passion or interest. I mean, I could, by simply talking about restructuring government, I knew that the group would be manageable tonight. You can talk about a lot of topics that, because of the interest in the topic, you can move people. So, will that alone attract enough governors to enough voters to come to give us critical mass and become a majority party again? Probably not. What I'm saying is that we need, at least within the ranks of the critical thinkers, and certainly here at the Kennedy School and around the country at our institutions of higher education and learning, what have you, we want to develop some sense of competence. And again, I know that's a word that has connotations we don't even want to touch even right here, but still a serious approach to developing alternatives to real problems. Now, several of the things that I talked about tonight will clearly generate almost exclusive negative publicity. I mean, there's no real upside in them. And yet, again, if we constantly pander to whatever the public opinion polls are telling us, then we're never going to solve the problems, and they just as soon have somebody that they like and preserve the status quo who's not going to solve the problems, is take a chance on another group that doesn't seem to be inclined to solve the problems, and at this point is largely an unknown entity and to their way of thinking. So we've got to somehow capture the imagination of the American people and convince them that we're willing to deal seriously with some of these problems. And I think there's a great deal of cynicism out there that either a candidate or a party, if they don't have a candidate who wants to move to expand the envelope a little bit, could capture. But if I'm wrong, I'll be giving this same lecture in the year 2020.
Let's open it up. I see a question up on the balcony.
Senator, I have two questions. The first, there's currently a movement on for D.C. statehood, and in this first question I wanted to ask kind of two parts. First, what do you understand the concerns of the pro-statehood people to be? And the second part of that question is, do you support D.C. statehood? And secondly, in speaking in terms of making a distinction between the Democratic Party and Republican Party, how would you see a Democratic administration going about the invasion of Panama? Would you have recommended following the same steps, or would a different course of action have suited us better?
Let me say, I'm not going to intentionally duck any of your question, but sometimes when there are two or three that I may just inadvertently, so bring me back if I skip any part. The first had to do with what are the what do I perceive those who are advocates of D.C. statehood to want to accomplish? And I would say that they want to accomplish a fuller sense of representation. They can elect a non-voting delegate. It's the current delegate, Walter Fauntleroy, isn't even given the title of congressman, which is a sore point with Walter, I know. But he has a vote in committee. He has no vote in the Congress. They can't otherwise participate in that part of the process. And if you look at it on the basis of what we attempt to accomplish by providing individual participation in the process, you can certainly make a very strong argument, notwithstanding the constitutional separation that was granted to the District of Columbia, that they ought to be treated like everybody else. The old argument about there are several states that have less population and what have you is a part of that whole process. I personally have indicated that I support statehood. I will tell you that is not a popular view in my own state of Virginia, particularly. The contiguous states, for a variety of reasons, don't. I took that position about 8 years ago, and I haven't changed from it. It's also not high on my list of priorities. There are a lot of things that I think that we ought to be spending time on in the Congress, most of which we probably won't, because we tend to deal with the emotional issues that all of us can relate to on an individual basis. I mean, we really get into it when Jesse Helms tells us what criteria we ought to apply to art. Now, you can argue that may not be the highest and best use of 100 elected officials from the 50 states discussing for 3 or 4 days on the floor the criteria that ought to be used to select art for the National Endowment. But that's what we get into. We get into other very emotional topics, and we flounder when it comes to dealing with the really important problems like the budget deficit or the major programs or the details, even in something like the SNL bailout, which is now projected to run perhaps as high as $400 billion. Okay, those were the first. What was the third question? Oh, Panama. Obviously, you would have to apply the question to any number of potential Democratic candidates, because those kinds of decisions are, and in my judgment, ought to be made by the President. The remarks I made earlier today dealt exclusively with foreign policy, and I suggested that I think it is terribly important that we develop what is in essence a nonpartisan foreign policy, and I think that we ought to have lively and vigorous debate internally, but when we get ready to speak externally, that we ought to speak with one voice, and I went through a bit of background in that particular area. I happen to support what happened in Panama. I went down and visited about a week after that operation took place. I spent time not only with the commanding generals, General Max Thurman and Carl Steiner, and all of the intermediate commands, as well as all of the assault units. I also talked to all of the soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, not all, but 2,000 or 3,000 of them. I talked with Endara and Ford and other members of the new government. At that point, clearly a fledgling government, if ever there was one. But I talked to a number of business leaders who had been impacted by that operation. I really talked to many, many people, and I would have to say that based on personal observation, not take anybody else's report, that I thought that as a matter of technical proficiency for our armed forces, that came, notwithstanding some glitches that always occur, but for an operation that required the insertion of over 20,000 combatants in an opposed landing or insertion at night, to have as few casualties as we actually had, to have as little collateral damage, to have as few civilian casualties. It was as close to perfection as you're ever going to get in an operation of that size and scope, and because of the special circumstances, even more so. But the Panamanians were almost universally, and I really mean that because I saw many under a variety of circumstances, and it wasn't just in the sort of the high-priced briefings and what have you, including the business leadership, and we had a long discussion with some of those folks. They said yes in terms of the damage, in terms of the downside. They said leaders who wanted United States help said yes, at least 98% of all of the collateral damage that was caused by Panamanians. It had nothing to do with the U.S. forces. And you can argue that we should have had military police function in earlier, and that's a lesson learned for the next time and what have you. But I would have done under the circumstances, I think what's done, but more importantly, I supported the President in that particular insertion. I thought that the objectives that we sought to accomplish, I'm obviously privy to some classified intelligence briefings and what have you, but based on the intelligence that I reviewed that was available to the President at that particular time, and lengthy discussions with Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and others, and I'm not sounding like a particularly partisan Democrat in this area, and I acknowledge that and suggest to you that this is an area where we ought not to attempt to be partisan. I would have done the same thing, or at the very least, I support it, and I thought the operation itself worked out about as well as anything that I have seen. Of great improvement over the almost laughable situation that occurred in the Grenada operation, for instance, and in several other areas where the joint command communications, the command and control techniques, the precision of delivery of weapons and munitions, a lot of gear that hadn't even been tested, all worked very well. So I felt much better about the concept. And let me make one other. You didn't ask this question, but just because it may be of interest. I've always been one that I think I mentioned national service in passing here. I'm prepared to talk about it at greater length. But I've always felt that each of us have some obligation to give something back, and hence have been one that would support an involuntary conscription if it was necessary to defend this country. But after talking to the individual troops that engaged in that operation, I was so impressed by what they were able to do and the extraordinarily high morale. In the Marine Corps we call it esprit de corps, but that they had, that I'm willing to rethink that part of the equation and not impose upon those who don't want to accept that particular responsibility in their country's defense to allow the program to go forward without trying to force it back onto the everybody participates track that I've been trying to force it onto for years. So to that extent, I learned, and I have revised my position somewhat with respect to how well the all-volunteer force is working. Under other conditions, it may not. In any event, I would have supported. It would depend on what Democrat. If it were my friend Sam Nunn, and I spent 2 years on him, working on him and on people around the country to get him to run for president, I suspect he'd have done the same thing. He and I went down there together to look at that particular operation. Yes.
Senator, you said in your talk that you'd like to see the president put some meat on the table. Yet it seems like the American public would more want a good bottle of wine on the table than some of this meat on the table. And I guess what I mean is some of the principles and proposals that you talked about tonight make a lot of sense, but unfortunately, as you mentioned, the American public in recent history had voted on values and not principles. What personally do you see as some of the values that over the next couple of years the Democratic Party can seize upon and make synonymous with the party in terms of winning some presidential elections?
Well, again, without attempting, and I have a long list that I'm not sure would be that helpful, but let me suggest to you it's the same kinds of things that both parties, I believe, are ultimately fighting over. And most recently in the last 8 years, particularly under President Reagan, he was very effective at constantly defining and redefining the America he wanted to live in. It didn't have to comport with reality. He just talked about this little world that was almost utopian. And whatever the question was, it either fit in that little square or it ought to fit in that little square. And the little square was always defined by values. And there wasn't a great deal of evident concern over why or how things didn't fit into that utopian world. It's just that, by golly, they ought to. Well, what we need to do is re-identify with some of those basic values, and some of it comes to something fairly simple like a willingness to defend, and it's not as important now because of the changed circumstances internationally, but a willingness to defend something, some basic values. We may all draw the line at a slightly different place, but there's got to be something in our lives that means enough to us as an individual that we're willing to fight for it, and the ultimate risk is to ultimately put yourself, if you will, in harm's way or something. Identifying with that degree of somehow being a part of something a little bit bigger than the rest of us are. Any number of things that, in terms of, I talked about the making a differentiation between a politics of entitlement and a politics of reciprocal obligation. That's one of the areas where we really get hurt, because we have a lot of very compassionate programs, which you remember lose to values in any contest that those are the two competing interests. But we have a lot of programs that are designed to be compassionate, and yet in many cases they end up creating a dependency rather than an independency, and we're perceived to somehow be a part of the, if you will, the Republican definition of a welfare state. I'm not suggesting that we don't have a real responsibility in that area, and I've talked about some of the other things and some things I've done here in the last 24 hours. But we need to somehow always hold out the belief that we're trying to achieve a certain standard, and that yes, we are a compassionate, caring nation. And I particularly think that we need to devote more time, energy, attention, and resources to some targeted areas like urban underclass areas where there are no positive reinforcement, no exposure to the kinds of values that we're talking about. But somehow identifying the things that are important in our daily lives, the things that you would say, where if you were asked to describe what's important to you personally or your family, we have to identify with those kinds of values. If we can do that, I think that we'll be able to move beyond this perception that the Democratic Party stands for nothing but a collection of individual interest groups, particularly some of the more avant-garde interests, which the Republicans always like to point out are the mainstay of the Democratic constituency, and somehow being opposed to the things that translate into values. In the 1988 presidential campaign, the Republicans were very successful in creating real doubt that my friend Mike Dukakis over here was willing to defend our national security interest, our economic security interest, and through some creative use of some advertising, which we hope we won't see again, that he was even unwilling to defend our personal security, which really has very little to do with a presidential campaign. But once you can create a doubt as to a couple of the areas, it's very easy to then bootstrap another area which really does get close to home, and that's personal safety. Even though, as I say, if you see the president or federal troops that are out patrolling your streets at any time to provide for that federal safety, I hope you'll tell me about it. You won't have to, because we'll immobilize and we'll be in a very difficult situation.
Earlier tonight, you characterized the Democratic Party historically as being a party of inclusiveness, including many beliefs, many perspectives. Yet you also referred to the American people's kind of preoccupation with values, by which I presume you mean a set of beliefs that's kind of a undergirding for our society as a whole. How would you reconcile the kind of contradiction, perhaps, in those two poles? How would you respond to what I think is the most common criticism of Democratic leadership today, which is that if you stand for everything, you sort of stand for nothing? Oh,
let me say I agree with that. You cannot stand for everything, and I'm not suggesting that. That's the reason that we've attempted. Let me make, Jess, I will send you a copy of what we call, I'm sorry I don't have it with me because I'd like to pass it out right now, what we called the New Orleans Declaration. But you will see in each of these areas, we're not really talking about standing for everything. To the contrary, a very clear choice is actually made in each of these areas. We put together about 10 or 12 areas and tried, and we worked a lot on the wording, and I'll send to Jess so that he can give to anybody that's interested here that declaration. I'd be interested in your reaction to it. But no, you're right. You cannot try to stand for everything, and you have to imply choices in each case, and indeed that's what we're trying to do.
How do you think that conflicts with the traditional party goal of inclusiveness? Do you think that perhaps disenfranchises part of your traditional constituencies?
No, again, I think that's the reason I think that we have to build a party around values and not around programs, and indeed not around constituencies. I would argue that the age of constituency politics has clearly passed. You can check the tombstone to find out precisely when it passed into clear minority status, but the old Roosevelt coalition that was based, or appeared to be based, on constituency groups in a different era with a different form of support for political campaigns, candidates, and a different allegiance to party and what have you. I would argue that it never really was constituency groups. It's just that there was a coalition of interests that were identified by their constituency group. That's no longer the case. One of the things that we wanted to accomplish in the Iowa primaries, for instance, Iowa caucuses in 1988, and I think if we accomplished nothing else in terms of what was regarded as Super Tuesday, was to shift the focus from each candidate identifying with every single constituency group that came along and appearing in the eyes of some to make a rather unseemly appeal, going hand in hand and subscribing to individual agendas. We wanted to move beyond that and move to the point where the individual candidates for our party nomination were at least looking beyond Iowa and knowing that somewhere soon they were going to have to develop a national message that was not based on constituency politics. If you look at the 1988 election and look at those groups that are described as the traditional building blocks of the Democratic Party or whatever, Mike Dukakis did better than any of our other candidates in the last couple of decades in terms of carrying those groups. The groups just aren't big enough by themselves to elect a president anymore. So we've got to expand, and we've got to create a coalition that's based not on constituency groups, but on ideas and values. And that's the way you get around that particular hang-up with the individual constituency groups.
We're running out of time. We'll let fellow Mississippian John Jameson have the last question.
I'll stick around for a couple minutes if there are others that have...
Governor, at the risk of beating a dead horse, I did want to get back to something that coincidentally was that Jess had mentioned earlier, and it's just what you say about George Bush. I mean, I think you were absolutely right when you said we can't be personal when we attack. And we also can't be seen as someone who's continually attacking, like the wine on Harvest Moon rap that Mondale was called by Reagan. But nonetheless, I think there are plenty of things that we can talk about. Some you've touched on. I mean, in Harlem, there was a recent New England Journal of Medicine article that showed that a black person born in Harlem has a lower life expectancy than a male born in Bangladesh. I mean, we're getting beat competitively by Japan and West Germany and maybe the rest of the EC countries, in the next few years because our interest costs are so high because of the Reagan-Bush deficit. The S&L crisis. I mean, again, when we have the drugs and all these other huge problems, because of some Reagan-Bush malfeasance over the past few years, we're spending well over $100 billion dealing with those problems, and just a pittance of that dealing with things that are important. And my point is that I think we have to attack from a partisan standpoint if we ever hope to win. But even if we were not ideological at all, even if you don't care whether it is a Democrat or Republican in the White House, Bush is absolutely wrong on this. The only way he's going to change his behavior is for us to point out that he is wrong. And what I would suggest is that what Speaker Foley and Majority Leader Mitchell need to do is spend a little less time acting like they're in the governing party and a little more time, act like we are in opposition and that we do need to point out these things. And I wondered if you agree on what we need to do between now and the time we have a presidential nominee.
Let me comment. Yeah, I mean, the point is well taken. Let me address the last part of your question or comment or however first and say that I have a certain degree of sympathy, empathy, whatever it is, for both George Mitchell and Tom Foley. I don't see as much of Tom Foley, but I see a lot of George Mitchell. And I see the difficulty he has trying to hammer out a consensus just on the Democratic side for issues. So until he feels he has something approaching Democratic consensus, if he is the majority leader, it's a little bit difficult for him to go out and make a speech taking position X and immediately have 15 Democrats come out and take position Y, whatever the case may be. I only mention that because it's not as easy as it seems to get some sort of consensus within our own ranks. I agree with you in terms of taking on the president. I happen to feel that the area where the president, both the current president and his immediate predecessor, have fallen down the most is in the area of fiscal responsibility. And that's supposed to be their strong suit. And as one who ends up backing, as most Democrats do, the president on a number of issues. If I think he's right, I'm going to support him. But I have taken him to task in almost every fora that you can think of with respect to abdication of responsibility or leadership on this particular issue. I fight regularly with Dick Darman and some of the representatives. and I say again now, I guess this is or was being covered, whatever it is. I mean, I fundamentally fault the president for failing to provide leadership in solving our fiscal crisis in this country. And he is almost alone in being in a position to do so. I used to approach then President Reagan, and I was then then chairman of the Democratic Governors Association. We had 35 Democratic governors, and we were already heading down this slippery slope, or however you want to describe it, toward serious fiscal irresponsibility. And I said with all of the Democratic governors in the room, over in the East Room of the White House, when we have our annual NGA meetings, I said, most of us understand how difficult the choices are. And most of us understand that almost any decision you make is going to create a lot of flack. And I said, we are prepared to help you solve that problem. We're prepared because we know how difficult it is to put together a budget, because we do it in our own states. We're prepared to help you take the flack if you'll simply provide the leadership, ask the American people and the Congress to do something. And we didn't get we got a nice response. It was not an affirmative response. So I continue to beat up on President Reagan. I continue to beat up on President Bush, as well as Dick Darma, Nick Brady, everybody else that comes up to Congress. I mentioned in the group earlier, I'm sitting down in the middle of the road in terms of getting out a budget resolution because I want the Democrats to call their bluff. I'm tired of us letting them establish the parameters and make us look like the guilty party in not doing what needs to be done. And that's what I was talking about, this whole concept that the legislative impasse, as well as the fiscal situation and deficits, play right into the Republican hands, because they just manage to use that to lean all over our domestic agenda and have us frightened to do anything about it, because the only way you can under those circumstances is to talk about taxes. So they continue to push back, and we can't address the Democratic agenda. Ronald Reagan got away with it for 8 years, and so far the first 2 years George Bush has gotten away with the same thing. And so, yes, I'm willing to take the president and others to task, and I think we ought to, but I would go back that I think we ought to do it on the basis of individual issues, point out our differences, and don't make it appear to be a personal attack. I'm one that, as you know, we've talked about this in terms of campaigning before, I think you gain very little if an attack is even perceived as being personal. If it's perceived as being issue-oriented, people will applaud you even if they don't happen to hold that particular view. But I think our party makes a mistake if they simply go after it, using the two before example, and Jess wasn't signing on to that specifically, although there's an analogy. As you know, I even had a Senate race where my opponent came out with a baseball bat in his hand the first day. He wasn't a serious candidate after that. Voters are a lot smarter than we think they are. They make an occasional wrong decision, in my judgment, but they make an awful lot of right decisions. And they can see through, with the possible exception of an occasional presidential election where the paid advertising is deplorable, at least in terms of what I think ought to represent presidential campaigns. They understand, and so I would say go back, attack, but attack on an issue-oriented basis. Put a better mousetrap out there. Don't just wring your hands and decry the lack of mousetraps, or we're not going to be able to win that particular situation. But you and I are not as far apart as we might think, and any ideas you've got beyond those or others encourage people. The last part is, until we get the presidency, we don't have the bully pulpit that lets everyone know that we're disappointed or upset with a particular position that a president may have taken. I mean, we got speeches being made on all the time, taking the president to task. I mean, just letting her rip out there on the Senate floor. And I preside a lot, so I watch somebody go out there, and it just disappears as soon as the speech is over. Press has all watched it. Everybody in the Senate, everybody's got the closed circuit C-SPAN. They all watch it. It just disappears from the face of the earth. The president says it. He'll get attention. Occasionally, if somebody from the leadership says something, that gets a little more attention. But most of the rest of the speeches just disappear almost as quickly as they're delivered. Well, I'm not discouraged, frustrated, but I do have a sense that we, as a party, and I'm assuming that Those of you who are left probably have some interest, either Jess has required you to be here, or you have some interest in the fortunes of the Democratic Party. I think if we're willing to make some of these decisions that we talked about, establish some principled approaches to serious questions that will be taken seriously. But until we do that, until we're willing to ask people to do things that they really don't want to do, my guess is that we're going to continue to occupy the position of always wondering why we've lost X number of additional elections at the national level, and until we get our act together, that's probably going to be our fate. But I think we can have a different fate, and if knowing of the involvement, I've got several people who are graduates of this fine institution who help me on a day-to-day basis, and I know the kind of intellectual rigor that you're exposed to here. I know the kind of ability that most of you who have been associated with this process have, and I know the kind of an impact you can make. So I would simply encourage you, either while you're here or certainly when you leave this institution, to bring some of that with you and help us get into the trenches and make some of the points that were made here and that I tried to make in my own modest way earlier. But for coming and spending some time this evening to talk about some of these questions and showing an interest in a competitive two-party process for one who has the opportunity to share a few views, a very sincere thank you.